Today we want to talk about a new topic, economic exposure. And in this section, we want to talk about, in this topic we have four sections. First, we want to talk about the measurement of the economic exposure. And then we want to talk about how to manage asset exposure. Asset exposure is one type of economic exposure. And the second type of the economic exposure is the operating exposure. And we want to talk about how to manage operating exposure. So we have four main topics we want to go through here. The next slide. Economic exposure. So this is the definition. Economic exposure is the change of the foreign exchange rate onto the market value of the firm. Okay, so here we're talking about the sensitivity of the value of the firm to a change in the exchange rate. And the main concept in economic exposure is that it's entirely possible for a firm that does not have any international trade and still have the economic exposure. And let's assume that we have industrial company in the United States specializing in producing high quality machinery. And all of this material are sourced domestically, so there will be no international imports. And this firm, the only market for the product will be in the United States, so there will be no international trade in terms of the exporting either. So we're talking about 100% American firm, and the input and the market are entirely within the United States. But this company still have economic exposure, in the sense that let's assume that the machine came from, say, Vietnam, and due to the depreciation of its national currency, and would be able to sell their Vietnamese machinery in the United States at a much lower prices, very competitive prices. And that could possibly drive this entirely 100% American firm out of the US market, just because the price is not competitive. Although these American companies do not do any kind of business outside the United States. So the notion of economic exposure, okay, apply not just to those multinational corporations, and also apply to those 100% domestic firms as well. So this is the economic exposure. And so here we're talking about the competitiveness position of this firm, whether a firm's competitiveness is affected by a change in the exchange rate. And that's the main focus of the economic exposure. Next slide. And in terms of the impact onto the stock prices, the market value of the firm, and it also has to do with the notion of the so-called market efficiency. And the thing that you learn in your Bsad 180, 181, 282, if your professor talking about market efficiency, the market efficiency hypothesis proposed that the stock prices already fully and instantaneously reflect all of the available information. So if the market already has the complete expectation about the change in the exchange rate, then when the exchange rate indeed start to move, then we are not going to observe any kind of impact on stock prices, because stock prices have already reflected when the market first formed the expectation. Okay, so here the notion of market efficiency also have implication on this particular exposure, the economic exposure. Next slide. There are two channels by which we'll be able to observe economic exposure. in this particular chart, the upper portion of the chart show you that one type of economic exposure is asset exposure. Asset exposure is about the home currency value of the asset or liability outside of your home country. For example, let's say that the Disney has a Disney park in Shanghai, and so this is a foreign asset. This is an overseas asset, owned by an American company. So the value of this Shanghai Disney, measured in US dollar, okay, is something that very important to the Disney shareholder in the United States. If the value of that overseas property goes up in terms of US dollar, then you will see the stock price traded on the New York Stock Exchange goes up, and vice versa. So we do want to know about the home currency value of those foreign asset or those foreign liability. And this kind of the sensitivity, we call that asset exposure. There is an even more important part of economic exposure that has impact on the stock value of the firm, is the so-called operating exposure. That is at the lower part of this particular chart. And here we're talking about that the impact of the foreign exchange rate onto the future operating cash flow of the firm measured in home currency. From our perspective, that would be the US dollar operating cash flow, whether a change in foreign currency lead to a greater amount of US dollar operating cash flow or leading to a lower amount of operating cash flow, and therefore leading to a higher stock prices or lower stock prices. And that's a kind of question that a lot of the CEO, CFO will want to have a good idea about. And both asset exposure and operating exposure has impact on the firm value, on the stock value, etc. And let's go down to the next slide. Okay, so the amount of the exposure and also the sign of exposure, whether that's a positive exposure, whether that's a negative exposure, and also that magnitude is something that when we learn about this set of topic, something we wanted to figure it out. There are a statistics model that we can rely upon to derive those sensitivity, but those sensitivity heavily relies upon our assessment about our business model. So the resulting exposure estimate just estimate, okay, and we may or may not entirely get it right before the fact. And for the slide, from slide number 7, that will be the next slide, all the way to slide number 17. And for this semester, because the difficulty of talking about extremely quantitative material, so I decided to skip the material in the slide number 7 to 17. And in this 10th slide, we have a numerical example to illustrate the calculation of the asset exposure. And asset exposure, although I don't want to go into detail, which you can read those numerical illustration, but the main idea about the asset exposure is come from two things. One is the conversion effect. That means that the value of the foreign asset or foreign liability translate from the foreign currency to home currency. So if let's say that the foreign currency appreciate, then the value of the foreign asset goes up through this conversion effect and vice versa. So that's one type of of thing we would need to look into when we try to figure out the asset exposure. One is this conversion effect. That's entirely based on the change in exchange rate. And there is another important fact, that is the value measured in foreign currency for the foreign asset or liability when the foreign currency appreciate or depreciate. Whether that lead to a higher value or a lower market value of the asset liability measured in foreign currency. That's another important factor. It's going to drive the resulting asset exposure. And in our previous example, the Shanghai Disney. So what would be this particular fact? For example, if the Chinese yen appreciate down the road, and what would happen to the value of the Shanghai Disney in terms of Chinese yen? That's the kind of effect I'm just talking about. We can call that local effect. The local effect refers to the value of that asset in terms of local currency, that would be Chinese yen, when the Chinese yen appreciate or depreciate. Okay, and that effect is also play into a very important part of the final asset exposure. So asset exposure is an aggregation of the local effect and also the conversion effect. Local effect is that foreign asset in terms of the local currency, whether that goes up or go down relative to the change in the local currency. And the second effect is a conversion effect. That would be the converting the value in local currency back to the home currency. So we have these two effects sum up together, aggregate together, that leading to the asset exposure. So that's an intuition. Basically, when we talk about asset exposure, when you read the slide from slide number 7 to number 17, if so desire, you can read those slides. And I do not want to go through these 10 slides because it's so difficult to go through this online instruction to talk about those kind of really detailed kind of the number and computation. And it's quite likely that a lot of you I'm going to lose a lot of you. Okay, so I decided that this semester I do not want to go through those numerical detail. But if you really want to learn about those computation, you can read slide number 7 to 17, and just with the basic idea that I just provide to you, then you should be able to go through those. And for our final exam, for our final project, okay, and that would be a project that would be a report that would not need to relies upon the material from on the slide number 7 to 17. So you can view the slide from number 7 to 17 as some sort of additional material, extra material that are not essential to the final exam or final report. Okay, so I want to skip those slides. So let's go to slide number 18. And slide number 18, okay, here we wanted to talk about the second type of exposure. That would be the operating exposure. Operating exposure is the sensitivity of the firm's operating cash flow measured in home currency. In our case, that would be the operating cash flow in US dollar to a change in exchange rate. So we want to see that whenever there's a change in exchange rate, whether that lead to a greater amount of the US dollar operating cash flow or a lower US dollar operating cash flow. And so here there are two effects. Okay, the second effect on this slide talking about conversion effect. That's the same effect that I just mentioned for the asset exposure, conversion effect is just the cash flow measured in local currency, in foreign currency. When we convert that back to our home currency, US dollar, and that conversion effect, the amount of US dollar you'll be able to convert is based on that exchange rate. So whenever there's a change in the exchange rate, it has a shock, it has an implication on the amount of US dollar we'll be able to convert it back. And that's what we refer to the so-called conversion effect. And the first effect is an even more important effect than the conversion effect. The first type of effect, we call that competitive effect. Competitive effect refers to that, to what extent that you will be able to strengthen or maintain your competitiveness of doing business overseas whenever there is a change in the exchange rate. Okay, and in slide number 19, from 19 to 27, again, I don't want to go through the detail of those numbers, but I can kind of explain in a intuitive fashion. In the next example, we have a U.S. firm and owning a British subsidiary, and this U.S. firm manufacture and sell PC in the British market, and this operation require import microchip from United States. So there is a cost component tied to the US dollar, because you will need to pay US dollar in order to acquire this essential component to produce the PC. But this product would be sold in United Kingdom, in British pound. Okay, so it really depends on that. Whenever there is appreciation of the US dollar, okay, like the situation we have here, then it's going to lead to the increase of the production cost. And so for this British operation, the key component, the key concept would be whether this British firm would be able to pass on this increase in production cost onto its local customer, and its ability to pass on this increase in in cost increase would depends on how unique, how competitive that this producer is. If the kind of PC manufactured by this British firm is very special, for example, military grade type of a PC, okay, and the end consumer will buy your product regardless what kind of price that you charge, because you are the only manufacturer will be able to produce this kind of special kind of PC. Then you can then it's easier for you to pass on the increase in the production cost onto the consumer, and therefore you will be able to maintain a very similar kind of profit margin, and then this profit margin translate into the higher value of US dollar, okay, and actually, okay, in terms of US dollar, you are doing pretty darn good. On the other hand, if the kind of PC that you produce are for the typical is inexpensive commodity type of a PC, then your ability to raise price will be very limited because you have large number of competitors. Your product is not that special. When that is the case, often the case that your profit margin is going to be very, very small, okay, as a result, and therefore the resulting cash flow in US dollar, after you convert that back to US dollar, and there will be a severe decrease in terms of the operating cash flow in US dollar. So the amount of the impact, the amount of operating exposure will heavily rely upon this so-called competitive effect. Okay, so we have a conversion effect, we have a competitiveness effect, and these are the two things that is going to determine that to what extent that the firm has the operating exposure. And when a firm has operating exposure, and the majority of firms have operating exposure. Operating exposure is a much more important type of exposure compared to the asset exposure. So here, the management of economic exposure, I wanted to focus on the management of operating exposure. There are a list of the strategy that the firm would be able to adapt to deal with operating exposure. And that will be starting on slide number 28. So let's skip to slide number 28. Let's see what kind of thing a firm would be able to adapt, and such that the amount of the operating exposure could be minimized. And the operating exposure is largely determined by the market structure of input and output. That would based on what type of specialty that you have, whether the kind of PC, for example, in our previous example, whether the PC is unique, is a military grade PC, or the kind of special kind of a PC or special kind of product that no other competitor would be able to compete with you, such that you have a large ability to make the pricing and with respect to the cost increase. And another important thing is the ability to adjust. Okay, so often the case that for the firm is to focusing on the second dimension, is trying to make sure that the firm has a lot of ability to adjust to the change in the exchange rate. And what would be those adjustments? Next slide. Okay, and that is tied to the long-term strategic planning, and also try to make sure that the competitive position of the firm during the change in exchange rate would not be so subject to this kind of external shock. And next slide. So here we have a list of the strategy, and starting with the selecting low-cost production sites, and then all the way to financial hedging. Let's take a look one at a time. Next slide. Select low-cost production sites, and a firm may wish to diversify the location of its production site to not just one location, and this tied to the notion of the supply chain. And in the past, that a lot of firms tend to have just one route of supply chain. And for many multinational companies, that China has been serving a very important part of the global supply chain. And like, for example, like Apple. The Apple phone, the majority of Apple phones that are being produced in China. So whenever we have a shock, and this shock this time around is this pandemic, but it could be a different form of shock, like the change in the exchange rate. If for some reason, okay, let's say that the Chinese yen appreciate, okay, a lot, say in the future, that's going to drive up the production costs in China, and that is going to lead into a lower amount of the operating cash flow in US dollar, for likely to leading to that outcome for Apple, and the Apple share may fall as a result. So the selecting low-cost production sites for Apple. Okay, the potential strategy would be not just to entirely rely upon China, maybe the Apple production need to diversify into the other low-cost production country, such as like Vietnam or like India. And that actually is something that the Apple has been doing in the past 2 years. And the Apple alone is the main partner. Foxconn have set up new production capacity in Vietnam and in India. So this is a kind of strategy allow you to diversify the risk of the rising Chinese yen. If you have production in multiple nations, when one nation the cost goes up, you can still rely upon the other two nations where the production cost is still relatively low, and therefore you are less subject to this exchange rate shock. So this particular approach has been quite popular among those large-scale production. And of course, the downside of having diversification in this kind of supply chain is potential the lack of economies of scale. And when for a medium-sized company, usually they cannot afford to make this kind of diversification, because when you have the production in 2 or 3 different nations, then that tend to lead to a higher unit cost. Then that kind of reduce this firm's competitiveness globally. So the selecting low-cost production site may work for some firm, but it may not work for the other firms. Next slide. Let's take a look at second strategy: flexible sourcing policy. And sourcing policy here, we're talking about the production inputs. And production input including raw materials, including human capital, etc. In terms of raw material, it may involving having the raw material come from not just one nation, it could be come from 2 or 3 different kind of nations. And then you'll be able to diversify away the operating exposure. In terms of the human capital, one example I list in this slide is Japan Airlines. Japan Airlines, JAL, and they use many flight attendants from many different nations, and they have this mixture of the human capital. And whenever one nation will be able to provide a less expensive human capital, then the JAL is going to use more people from this particular country and nation. So you have this flexibility in terms of the dealing with the cost increase, and that could be possibly due to the exchange rate fluctuation. Next slide. The third strategy is the diversification of the market. So in the previous 2 strategies, we're focusing on the production side. We're focusing on the production cost. Now we want to talk about the market where we sell our product and our services. That would be the market that we enter. If we just rely upon one market, then the exchange rate of that particular market is going to have tremendous amount of impacts on our operation. On the other hand, if our exporting market is more than one, then we'll be able to some degree diversify away the shock of those national currency value appreciation, depreciation. So that's a diversification of the market. Next slide. The fourth strategy is relating to how special and how unique your product and service is. Usually, when your products are indeed very special, then you have a much greater pricing power in the market. Okay, it means that your product is not priced elastic, and regardless of what price that you sell, they would need to purchase your product. And also, you are pretty much the only player in this particular segment of the market, or with very few competitors. If you are able to do so, then you are much more exempt from this kind of operating exposure. And the ability to be able to ensure that your products and your service are special is through the use of the research and development. Research and development give you an edge to make sure that your product and service are indeed unique. And also the product differentiation is a marketing strategy, allow you to create a niche for your product. So those are potentially useful strategies such that you will be more exempt from the operating exposure. Next slide. And another strategy is the use of those financial contracts, like forward, future, option, and swap. And operating exposure usually is ongoing kind of exposure. So it's not just a one-time kind of risk management, because it's a long horizon, multiple time periods kind of risk management. So the use of a swap can be effective, for some circumstances. So that would be the financial hedging, the use of financial instrument to deal with the operating exposure. And next slide. Then this is the end of this particular topic and chapter. And in this particular topic, and I skipped about maybe close to 20 slides. Those are heavily quantitative. And for those of you who in the future would be working in this particular domain, then you may want to read through those chapter and those slides. And if you have any difficulty understanding those slides, please do not hesitate to send me an email, and surely I will explain those slides with you. And it's just that those slides are tedious and it's not very friendly to be delivered through this particular online format. So I decided to skip those slides this semester. And for those of you who go ahead and study those slides, if you have any question, please send me email, and I will get back to you very quickly, answering all of your questions. And this is it for today. See you next time.